Hello everyone, welcome to the Spotlight. This is the second Spotlight in February 2006, and this is a special Spotlight if there ever has been one. So, a lot of people have been asking us about the Epstein stuff. So, I have to be careful here what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Epstein stuff, but in a very different way than you're hearing it from everybody else. And so just hold on to your seats. This is going to be really something. But let me sort of stitch a couple things together before I get into it. We're actually focusing a lot on Epstein type of stuff, even going back. I'm not going to explain this all now. I'm not going to explain this all today. But we're going to be stitching this stuff together, and it's going to be coming through in some of the other things that we're doing, including some podcasts that I'm going to be doing, where I'm invited to talk on someone else's podcast. The Epstein stuff is totally related to a huge amount of content that we have at Farsight. Now, I'm not going to go into it now in detail. I'm just going to sort of mention it and say, this is things we're going to be explaining further later. And Aziz, my son, he's going to be explaining the details of, he's like the anthropologist and archaeologist of Farsight. And he's got everything mapped out. But basically, Jeffrey Epstein was a Baal worshiper. He worshipped Baal. His temple on Epstein Island is a Baal temple. If you look at it the way it's built and then Google Baal temples, that's what he built. He's a worshiper of Baal. Baal is the same as Zeus and Ra are the same also. They are extraterrestrials. There's one extraterrestrial, the same guy, that has a standard modus operandi of raping underage girls, torturing, everything like that. Stuff that Epstein did was just, that's what they did. That's what the whole worship thing, that's what it all came down to. But we're going to have to explain that over a long period of time, because it's so complicated to stitch everything back together. But we're going to have to connect you with our other projects. We have a project on Ra, we have a project on Zeus, we have a project on on Baal versus Yam, and we're going to be connecting you to all these things and sort of slowly stitching things back together so that you get a bigger picture of what is going on. The Epstein stuff is not a guy. It's a huge conglomeration of some of the human elite that are built into the whole overall prison planet system. And if there's one thing that you should get is all the stuff that we've been talking about Earth being a prison planet and the bad ETs running the largest human trafficking operation on the whole world. It's all going to make sense when you see that their disciples, like Jeffrey Epstein, that's exactly what they were doing. They were just a page out of the same book. And so this is a lot of stuff we're going to have to patch together, and all of our past projects are going to be crucial for making this tapestry sort of stick. Aziz is going to be explaining a lot of the details. He's really great with that. And we're also patching it into a lot of our videos. We do know that Farsight's going to become very big in the not too distant future, and we're trying to prepare for that with our new quality videos, with a lot of the animation and stuff, because when the world turns in our direction, you can introduce yourself to people only once. And so we really have to be ready for not just a few thousand people, but a few millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people watching our stuff simultaneously. So that's why we're gearing up with the way we do things. I've been promising to show you a clip of Yeme's new session, and it's really an interesting project because the project is about mind control. The efforts of the U.S. government right now at studying and actually doing mind control, to be able to control people to do what they want. You know, it's like putting a chip in there, put the stuff in the brain, controlling them. And Yeme has a session that is very interesting. We also have Shantae has a spectacular session on it. And we're using all types of new animation stuff. But I wanted to give you an idea of what it sort of looks like, so you get an idea of the outfit and stuff like that. Because our outfits change depending totally on the topic itself. This one, Yeme, looks a little bit like Angelina Jolie and Tomb Raider. Guns on either side and the whole thing. So let me show you what that looks like. It's a very short clip, and then we'll get deep into the Epstein stuff. And what we're going to be talking about with regard to the Epstein stuff is nothing that you'll get anywhere else. It's totally unique to us. So hang on tight. You're going to see it. It's going to be great. All right, so let me just show you this real quick clip. It's a very short clip, like a minute or something. But let me show you that. Okay, here we go.
There's a type of battle. I have battle as a deduction. I'm not saying this is a war, but this is a huge back and forth with, like, there is a huge back and forth with opposition amongst multiple subjects. The subject that I have found would do anything to come out on top, even if it goes against his morale. I'm moving to the center of focus 1.
Are you certain? It matches the description perfectly.
So I keep seeing this circle with a very severe, very serious focal point. This focal point feels connected to like a specific subject or inside of a specific subject. Male, dark hair, pale skin, dark clothing. And he is very arrogant and spicy and a little above himself, I think. I'm picking up on like peaks, rocks, possible mountains. And around this area, I'm getting like eruptions of energy, upward movement, I have deductions of explosion or explosive.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of the types of stuff we're doing, and the amount of animation that we're putting into it is astounding. We're getting pretty close to finishing it, so it's going to be coming out pretty soon. And I'm not saying in a day or two, but it's going to be happening really soon. So in addition to that, we've got some other things coming out as well, including some live streams. But this right now is the spotlight, so let's dive into what we're here to talk about today, okay? All right, so let's begin. Friends, over the past several weeks, a very large body of previously restricted material relating to Jeffrey Epstein case has begun entering the public domain. Now, the scale of this release is unprecedented. We're talking about millions of pages of documents alongside a vast archive of images and video material now circulating outside traditional institutional channels. The volume is so large that no single organization, governmental, legal, journalistic, or academic, can plausibly digest it quickly or comprehensively. And that is part of the purpose of doing this. By dumping so much information out all at once, it basically causes a situation of collective constipation where people just can't do anything else. In addition, there's apparently 2.9 million additional documents that are being held back. So you can assume that those ones are way worse than the ones that are already coming out. But the ones that are already coming out are, to be quite honest, I have great difficulty either listening to them, watching them, or being told about them. I can't sleep at night when I get so I'm not going to be going into the details. You're going to get that from other people. But the 3 million documents, emails, videos, pictures that are still being held back, there's something going on. Anyway, so this first batch is to basically cause this type of collective constipation of having to process all of this, and still the worst is still there. Okay, so today, importantly, this presentation is not actually the batch of stuff that they've let out so far. It's not a single revelation or a neatly packaged disclosure event. It's a flood of fragmented information emerging unevenly across social media platforms, independent researchers, and decentralized networks. Now, this whole release that just came out of the Epstein files, much of it is being examined by private individuals and informal groups rather than by established media institutions, which are moving slowly, cautiously, or not at all. Now, as a result, the public is encountering this material in a diffuse and often disorienting way. Okay. What is becoming clear, however, is not simply the existence of criminal behavior, something that was already widely understood, but the scale, the duration, and the systemic embedding of that behavior. The material points towards long-running networks of exploitation enabled by secrecy, intimidation, legal complexity, and institutional protection. Now, whether one chooses to engage directly with the most disturbing evidence or not, the overall implication is absolutely unavoidable. The harm was not isolated, it was not accidental or short-lived, and it was not sustained by one individual acting alone. Now, with regard to that, I have to tell you that we do have some other Epstein projects on the way, and one of them is the entire network, going after the network. And after you see the one that we're going to be coming out with, the mind control stuff, the next one that we're working on and getting out is going to be that next thing about the network stuff. So, at the same time, oh, by the way, and we are going to be posting all of that stuff on FarsightPrime.com. That's where it's going to be. So at the same time, the institutional response to this release, the release that's currently being digested, the 3 million emails, the 200,000 pictures, and a few thousand videos. The institutional response to this release has been hesitant and very fragmented. Large portions of the material remain redacted, access to unfiltered records is restricted, and official narratives emphasize procedural caution, privacy, and legal liability. Now, these concerns are real and legitimate, but they also mean that the collective capacity to metabolize the truth is lagging behind the public's growing awareness that something fundamentally corrosive has been exposed. Now, this creates what can only be described as a dangerous, historically familiar condition. Public morale demands they escalate rapidly. Or actually, public moral demands escalate rapidly. You might be able to say it that way. And the calls for accountability, reform, and justice, while institutional legitimacy and capacity, they erode. So trust weakens not only in specific leaders or agencies, but in governing structures themselves. So the result is not clarity, but strain. You get outrage without resolution, information without orientation, and disclosure without a shared framework for understanding what it means. It is precisely at moments like this that societies are most vulnerable, not only to chaos, but to overcorrection. So, when institutions fail to respond credibly to legitimate demands and temptation grows to restore order through suppression, emergency measures, and coercive control, well, history shows that such responses may stabilize a system temporarily, but often at the cost of deeper long-term damage. So the purpose of this discussion that we're having now is not to catalog allegations, relive atrocities, or speculate about hidden motives. Others are already doing that work constantly, and much of it is emotionally overwhelming to me as well as to you guys. And to be honest, the images and videos, they are so terrible that I have great difficulty even looking at them, let alone listening to descriptions of them. They go way beyond my normal tolerance capabilities. So for our current discussion, I will avoid discussing any of the lurid details of the revelations. Others are doing that already, and you don't need me to do it also. But what you need from me is an explanation of what kind of political and social system is capable of surviving such revelations. So, right now, we are going to step back and address a different kind of question. What does a society do when exposure arrives faster than its institutions can adapt? Because these Epstein file things are coming like tidal waves. So what happens when this happens faster than the institutions can adapt? How does knowledge enter a system without destroying the system? And what distinguishes genuine leadership from mere repression under conditions of moral shock and systemic and rather an epistemic overload? So to answer these questions, we need to move away from scandal-driven thinking and toward a structural epistemic understanding of governance, legitimacy, and social stability. So that is the task of what I will address next. In short, we want to understand what the Epstein phenomena is doing to our ability to continue as a society and to the government's ability to continue governing. And finally, we want to understand the possible implications to the government's ability to continue its normal practice of governance by secrecy. If secrecy collapses and the ability of government to control secrecy of all sorts, including the reality of remote viewing, the existence of extraterrestrials, and what will happen next, then what will happen to all of us? You and me and everyone. We have answers to these questions, believe it or not, if we know what's going to happen. So let's begin. This is what I want to talk with you about. So let's begin with how societies stabilize, and also how they come apart, okay? So to understand what may be happening now, we first need to step back and talk about how societies become stable in the first place. Stability is not automatic. It is built and is maintained through shared expectations, loyalties, institutional habits, and they develop over a long period of time. Now, in democratic societies, one of the most important stabilizing mechanisms is a thing called institutionalized political alignment. What that means is that people come to identify with particular political parties, movements, and leaders. Now, these loyalties are not just rational calculations, they are psychological, social, and cultural. Now, over time, voters learn who they are politically, not just what they support. So, a very well-known framework for understanding this process was developed by the political scientist James L. Sundquist in his theory of partisan realignment. Partisan realignment as institutionalization is what we want to think about. In Sundquist's model, political stability arises when major social groups align reliably with the major political parties. Political conflict is channeled through predictable electoral competition, elections. And most citizens feel that the system, while imperfect, still represents them. Okay. In the United States, this has historically meant Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other side. with voters largely socialized into one camp or the other over time. Now, this alignment is a form of institutionalization. Now, it allows societies to manage disagreement without constant crises. It provides continuity, legitimacy, and a sense that change can occur within the system rather than against the system. Now, get this, guys. And I mean guys generically, men and women. Deinstitutionalization. What's that? This is the opposite of institutionalization. Deinstitutionalization is when new issues break the old loyalties. So, Sundquist's key insight is that political alignments are not permanent. They change. So, from time to time, a new issue or a cluster of issues emerges that cuts across the existing party loyalties. Now, these issues do not fit neatly into the old political categories. They affect people in both parties, often in deeply personal and moral ways. And when this happens, the old voter loyalties begin to weaken. Psychological bonds to the parties erode. And groups of voters, well, they just begin to shift or disengage. Either stop voting or vote for another party or whatever. And this process is called deinstitutionalization. Now, some degree of deinstitutionalization is normal and healthy. It allows societies to adapt, because situations adapt. And over time, new alignments form, parties change, and stability is restored at what you might call a new equilibrium. But when deinstitutionalization becomes dangerous, that's a problem. Problems arise when deinstitutionalization becomes too rapid or too intense. Now, history shows that when the old political identities collapse faster than the new ones can form, trust in leadership evaporates across all factions. We know this for a fact. And the system loses its ability to channel conflict electorally through elections. And societies enter a zone of serious instability. In the United States, the most extreme historical example was the period leading up to the Civil War, when the issue of slavery shattered existing party structures and made compromise absolutely impossible. Now, another major realignment occurred during the Great Depression, when the economic collapse delegitimized existing institutions and reshaped the political order ahead of World War II. So those are examples. Now, these periods were not simply political disagreements. They were crises of institutional meaning. So now let's apply this framework to the present moment, what we're dealing with right now. So what makes the current situation especially dangerous is the nature of the trigger. The Epstein revelations are not a policy disagreement. They are not about taxation or regulation or foreign trade. They are moral and institutional shocks that strike at the credibility of leadership itself. If these revelations become central to the public's moral imagination, if they dominate discourse across party lines, and if they undermine trust in elites broadly rather than selectively, and the scope at which these Epstein files are taking, cutting across leaders of all types everywhere, then they have the potential to drive serious deinstitutionalization. So, we can have divergent outcomes of deinstitutionalization, so let's talk about what could happen. What happens next depends on how societies process the shock. If different political groups interpret the revelations differently, realignment may occur. New coalitions could form, and parties transform or maybe be replaced. you get electoral politics surviving, although it's altered. That's one option. If, instead, large segments of society converge on a single conclusion that the leadership class itself is illegitimate, whoa, folks, then the situation becomes much more dangerous. This is something that cannot be handled by elections. At that point, politics shifts from competition to repudiation, and you have revolutionary dynamics that can emerge. And the system may collapse rather than realign. So you won't get the Sundquist realignment, you could get the collapse of the system instead. So historically, this is how revolutions begin. Early phases often include moral zealots, opportunists, and also established figures who are attempting to survive by riding the wave. But if the electoral mechanisms fail under this pressure, the risk of extra-constitutional intervention, friends, including military involvement, we're talking a coup type of thing, increases dramatically. And why this matters for what comes next is really important. The purpose of raising this framework is not to predict collapse, revolution, or coups. I'm not doing that. It is to show that societies do not destabilize because of disagreement alone. They destabilize when the institutional bonds dissolve faster than new structures can form. Now, to understand whether we are approaching such a moment and how it might unfold, we need to examine not just public outrage, which we are seeing, but institutional capacity and legitimacy and the mechanisms by which order is normally maintained. That's what we need to look at. And that brings us to the next step: how political systems manage or fail to manage the balance between public demands and institutional capacity. Now, institutional capacity and the limits of governance is really nicely looked at by another political scientist named Samuel Huntington. So we're going to use his ideas as a diagnostic lens. So to deepen this analysis, we now need a framework that helps us understand why societies fail under pressure, not just how political loyalties realign. So for that, one of the most useful and still relevant thinkers is the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington. Now, Huntington's core contribution was to shift attention away from ideology and personalities and toward institutional capacity. Now, his central question was simple, but it was profound. Can society's institutions, like Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, can society's institutions actually manage the demands being placed upon them? Can they handle it if the demands are so much? So we're talking about the capacity of those institutions to handle what's being asked of them versus the demand. Now, Huntington argued that political stability depends on the relationship between the two variables. Institutional capacity, now that includes, when we talk about institutional capacity, that includes things like bureaucratic competence, the legal systems, police, enforcement mechanisms. Now, legitimacy and trust also come into this. And it depends also on the ability to absorb stress without breaking. Now, the social demands, on the other hand, you have the institutions on one hand, but social demands, things that the people are demanding, these include things like political participation, moral expectations, and, demands for accountability, pressure for reform or punishment, okay? And also popular mobilization, how much people are mobilizing to deal with these things. So when these two variables of institutionalization and demands, or capacity versus demands, when they're roughly balanced, they're sort of equal, the institutions' capacity and also the demands on those institutions, when they're roughly balanced, then if they're balanced, then societies are governable. Things work out okay. You're not demanding too much of the government based on the demands, and also the demands are being satisfied. So, but when the capacity and the demands drift apart, instability follows. So there's sort of an equilibrium line. Huntington, you might conceive of it as saying, he illustrated it sort of with the relationship with a simple sort of conceptual idea. And I can sort of paraphrase this. This is not Huntington's actual sort of graph or anything like that, but it's a good graph that has been used by a variety of people to discuss Huntington's basic ideas. So on the vertical axis, you have institutional capacity, okay? Vertical axis, how much the institutions can handle. And on the horizontal axis, okay, you have the popular demands, participation, things like that. Now, in a stable society operates near a balance line where the institutions are strong enough to process the public demands, and the demands are structured enough to be handled through the institutional channels. So what that happens is, like, there's a 45-degree line that goes up where you go up and the institution's capacity is going up, but also the demands are going up, and you get a nice 45-degree line. And as long as the society is somewhere on that 45-degree line where the institution's capacity is going up and the demands are going up, everything's okay. Now, this is not utopia, it's simply functional governance. That's what happens when things work. So let's talk about the two paths to breakdown where this doesn't work anymore. Huntington identified two primary failure modes. One is where the demands outpace the capacity. People are just demanding stuff. They're outraged, they're rioting, things like that. That produces instability. When the public demands increase rapidly, but the institutional capacity does not rise to meet it, then the legal systems get overloaded. The trust in the whole system erodes. Enforcement becomes selective or arbitrary, and legitimacy collapses. This is the zone of unrest, paralysis, delegitimization, and potential breakdown. Now, importantly, Huntington emphasizes that this instability is not caused by public engagement itself, but by the institutions that cannot adapt quickly enough. All right, now let's talk about the other side. If the capacity of the institutions grows faster than the demand, then you get repression. So the second failure mode occurs when the institutional capacity grows faster than the public demands. You have basically too much government. And this often happens when elites respond to instability with control. Militarization increases. Surveillance expands. You've all been hearing about stuff like that, right? Participation is suppressed rather than processed. You see that happening, right? In this case, order may be restored temporarily, but at the cost of freedom, adaptability, and long-term legitimacy. So Huntington was clear. Repression is a sign of institutional failure, not strength. So why does this framework matter to us now with the Epstein stuff? So what makes Huntington's model especially relevant to the present moment is that both pressures can operate simultaneously. You get moral and political demands that are rapidly accelerating due to the exposure of all these Epstein files. But you also get institutional legitimacy and trust eroding at the same time. Now, the normal mechanisms that translate this outrage into reform are strained or even compromised completely. So this creates a dangerous compression. The demands spike, the capacity shrinks, and institutions face pressure to choose between paralysis and repression. Neither choice leads to long-term stability. We know this for a fact. This is what history tells us. And there's tremendous temptation for suppression. Huntington warned that when institutions feel overwhelmed, they often turn to emergency powers, coercive enforcement, restriction of participation, narrative control, spinning the news cycles. And these measures can appear necessary in the short term, especially when the elites feel threatened. And believe me, right now they feel threatened. But structurally, they move the society away from the equilibrium line, that 45-degree line that goes up, balancing the capacity of the institutions and the demands. It's moving society away from that, not towards the equilibrium line. So what you get in the short term is that order is preserved by force rather than legitimacy. And the structural insight, you might call it the key takeaway from Huntington, is not pessimism, it's diagnosis. Societies do not collapse because people demand too much. They collapse because the institutions fail to evolve at the pace that's required by the new realities. And that's what's happening to us now. When exposure and moral shock and deinstitutionalization converge, governance becomes a problem of capacity, not intent. They may want to solve things, but they can't. So let us set up what comes next. This brings us directly to the question we now need to face. If traditional institutions cannot absorb the demands created by large-scale exposure, and repression only deepens long-term instability, what does leadership look like under those conditions? Not leadership as control, not leadership as suppression, but leadership as adaptation, reorientation, and capacity building in the face of unavoidable truth. That is where we need to go next. Friends, why does secrecy initially boost institutional capacity? And why does it eventually destroy it in the end? So to understand what happens next, we need to talk honestly about secrecy. Not as a moral issue, but as a governing technology. Secrecy is not accidental in political systems. It exists because in the short term it works. Secrecy initially boosts institutional capacity in several ways. It reduces the number of demands that institutions must process. If people don't know something, they don't protest. And it delays moral reckoning, buying time for the elites to manage crises internally. It simplifies governance by limiting who knows what and therefore who can object. And it allows institutions to appear stable even when internal contradictions are growing. Now, in Huntington's terms, secrecy artificially keeps society above the equilibrium line. Demands are suppressed or never allowed to form, so capacity appears sufficient. And, like with the Epstein files, for the longest time, the government was saying the files don't exist, or there's nothing there. And then a few hundred things come out, and then a few million things come out. The secrecy was attempted to control it. But this is why secrecy has been such a durable feature of governance across history. Sometimes it works. It creates the appearance of order. But sometimes the problem is so big, it doesn't work. The hidden cost of secrecy is crucial to understand. Secrecy carries a structural cost that is often invisible until it's too late. And over time, secrecy prevents institutional learning. People don't adapt and change. And then the problems that cannot be named cannot be solved. Things just go out of whack and they stay out of whack. And it decouples the institutions from moral reality. And decision makers stop responding to the society's values, and they start responding only to internal risk, their own internal risk. And it concentrates power and error. And fewer people know more, and mistakes compound without correction. It gets worse and worse. And this weakens legitimacy silently. Trust erodes long before the exposure occurs, and even if people can't articulate it why, they know something's not right and they don't trust the leaders. So secrecy does not strengthen institutions indefinitely. It atrophies them. It atrophies them. And capacity appears high, but adaptability completely collapses. So it's a trap. Secrecy is a trap. This creates what we might call the secrecy trap. The more secrecy is used to preserve order, the less capable the institutions become of handling truth. And the more catastrophic exposure becomes when it finally arrives. And at that point, secrecy flips from being a stabilizer to a multiplier of instability. So when the truth breaks through, demands surge. Suddenly, institutions are unprepared, and legitimacy collapses rapidly. And the leaders, well, they reach for repression because adaptation is no longer possible. And yes, we can start thinking about a possible situation in which people at least will be thinking about canceling the November 2026 elections or for having a military intervention. That kind of thinking becomes possible. And this is not a moral failure. It's a structural inevitability of prolonged secrecy. Now, this blends into the type of secrecy we've been talking about forever, which is disclosure with the UFO stuff, the ET stuff, and everything. The whole idea of secrecy, it's beginning to turn around and bite the power structures in the butt. So let's talk about how disclosure changes the capacity and demand relationship, because that's what we really need to understand. So this brings us to disclosure, not as an event, but as a systemic transformation of the society. Disclosure does something very specific to Huntington's model. It does not simply increase public demands. It changes the shape of the graph itself. and this is how. There's a short-term effect, which is the demand shock. Now, in the short term, disclosure causes a rapid spike in moral and political demands, like immediate outrage that outpaces institutional response. And in a sense that, it also gets a sense that governance is failing. This is the moment people often mistake for chaos, but that's not it. That's not the chaos. This is only the first order effect. The long-term effect is what we need to talk about. That's capacity rebuilding. So over time, if disclosure is allowed to continue, something else happens. Disclosure restores feedback loops between society and the institutions. Now, it forces the institutional adaptation rather than concealment, and that's important. disclosure distributes the epistemic responsibility across the population. And it reduces the reliance on elite gatekeeping, which is what you see so much of these days. In other words, disclosure eventually raises institutional capacity naturally, not by strengthening control, but by rebuilding legitimacy and adaptability. Without disclosure, that stuff can't happen. So the institutions that survive disclosure become more transparent, more responsive, and less brittle. And they're more aligned with societal reality, and that's where we want to go. So the crucial distinction is this. This is the distinction that matters most. Secrecy manages demands by suppressing them. Disclosure manages demands by transforming the institutions. Secrecy keeps the system stable until it doesn't. Disclosure destabilizes the system so it can adapt. So let me talk about why repression is the wrong response. So when disclosure hits, the instinctive response of threatened institutions is repression. Even pull out the troops, bring out the soldiers. It's to control the information, deny things, say it didn't happen, limit participation, maybe even cancel elections, enforce compliance, or else. But repression moves the society farther away from that equilibrium line. It reduces the demand only temporarily while permanently damaging capacity. And that's not good. Huntington's model helps us see this clearly. Repression treats the demand as the problem. But when the capacity is the real issue, you're treating the wrong illness. Capacity is the problem, not the demands. Now, the leadership question that this raises is the following. This leads directly to the central leadership question of our time that we are facing right now. When secrecy collapses and disclosure drives demands beyond what institutions can immediately handle, do leaders choose repression or transformation? Repression restores order by force. Transformation restores order by adaptation. Only one of these paths preserves long-term stability. Setting up what comes next is the key. If secrecy ultimately destroys capacity and disclosure initially overwhelms the institutions but later strengthens them, then the real question is no longer whether disclosure should happen, because obviously it should. The question becomes, how does a society lead itself through disclosure without collapsing or turning authoritarian? That's the question. And that's the problem we now need to confront. So, before we go any further, I want us to slow down for a moment. What we're talking about, disclosure, collapse, deinstitutionalization, can feel abstract and heavy, but there's a very human way to understand what happens when long-standing bonds break. Friends, it's Shakespeare. Shakespeare understood this better than almost anyone. And in his sonnets, he had a whole bunch of sonnets that he wrote, not just his plays, and the sonnets, they're numbered. He often writes about the pain of realizing that something that you trusted, loved, and built your identity around is no longer what you thought it was. One of his most famous lines comes from Shakespeare's sonnet, actually sonnet number 30, and here it is. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past. You've all been there. You remember things that were really great, and they no longer are, and you're remembering those things that have passed. Shakespeare is describing that quiet, late night moment when you replay everything you believed was solid, and suddenly it isn't. Now, there's also the pain of broken attachment. And in another sonnet, this is number 116, he writes, "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds." You get that? Love is not love when it alters what alteration finds. That line is often quoted romantically, but it carries something sharper. It speaks to the shock of discovering that what you thought was enduring changes under pressure. And so it's not really love if you say, "I don't want you to be like that anymore. I want you to change." That's not just a personal realization. That's an identity rupture. Anyone who has gone through a serious breakup knows this feeling. You don't just lose a person, you lose a story about who you were, and a story about what the world made sense. So, let's go from personal breakup to collective dislocation. Now here's the connection. What happens to a person in a painful breakup is structurally similar to what happens to a society during deinstitutionalization. Now, Shakespeare, he gives us another line from Sonnet 145, and it perfectly captures this. Here it is. "I hate, from hate away she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you." Now you have to understand, that means she was looking at you, and she's expressing and feeling hate, but she finally says, "It's not you." So there's confusion, there's a contradiction, there's emotional whiplash. That's what it feels like when loyalties dissolve, institutions that you trusted are exposed, and the moral grounds shift under your feet. And at the individual level, we call this heartbreak. At the societal level, we call it realignment, crisis, or collapse. But psychologically, it's the same mechanism. So let's talk about why this matters for politics and society when millions of people experience this kind of rupture at the same time. And that's what's happening right now with the Epstein revelations. Old allegiances are weakening, identities becoming unstable, and people look urgently for something to replace what was lost. And this is why periods of disclosure and exposure are so dangerous and so transformative at the same time. So just as in personal heartbreak, some people retreat, some become angry, some rush into new attachments too quickly. We've all done that, right? And some begin the slow, painful work of understanding what went wrong. Societies do exactly the same thing. So let's bring this all back to our present moment right now. So when we talk about collapsing trust, evaporating legitimacy, rising demands, and the temptation towards repression, we're not talking about abstract systems alone. Friends, we're talking about collective heartbreak, a society discovering that what it loved, trusted, and identified, when it identified with, is no longer what it appeared to be. Understanding this doesn't weaken us. It helps us avoid panic and bad rebounds. So, Shakespeare reminds us that pain doesn't mean failure. It means transition. So, this is the question, both for individuals and for societies. It's not how do we avoid the pain. That's not it. It's how do we move through it without losing ourselves. And that's where leadership, disclosure, and institutional adaptation re-enter the conversation. So, when saving the relationship is no longer possible, we have to think about that. There is one more hard truth we need to face, both personally and collectively as a nation and as a world. The highest priority is always to save the relationship. That's what we always want to do. Between people, between citizens and the institutions, between society and its governing structures. We always want to save that. But sometimes that is simply not possible. We can't save it. And just as in human relationships, there are moments when trust is too deeply broken. Harm has gone too far. And no amount of effort can restore what once was. It's gone. It's over. And in those cases, insisting on preservation can do more damage than simply letting go. We've all been there with relationships. Societies, like people, can reach a point where continuation becomes more destructive than dissolution. Guys, friends, and I mean guys generically, men and women, I'm going to pivot a little bit and go to a fan favorite for me, Star Trek. Okay? It's really important. There was a moment in Star Trek, The Next Generation, and I'm taking this from Season 2, Episode 21, for those Star Trek fans. It captures this truth with remarkable clarity. Now, the android, Data, runs a battle simulation and he fails. He loses. He does everything correctly, logically, precisely, without error, yet he still loses. Now he's very disturbed by this, and Data retreats, believing that something in him must be broken. He goes and runs diagnostics and all types of things. And finally the captain, Jean-Luc Picard, comes to speak with him, and he says, listen, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not weakness. That is life. That line is not about warfare. It's about reality. So let's apply this to societies, our societies. What Picard is saying applies just as much to civilizations as it does to individuals. A society can follow its rules. It can trust its leaders. It can believe in its institutions. And it can still arrive at a point where those institutions can no longer hold. They can no longer hold. So what does this mean? The society fails. Does that mean that the society fails? What does this mean? Does it fail? No. It does not mean that the people were foolish. And it does not mean that there was a single mistake that, if corrected, would fix everything. No, something else happens. Sometimes the loss is structural. It's not moral. And let's talk about why this matters right now, this very moment. This distinction is critical because one of the most dangerous instincts during institutional collapse is the belief that if we just find the right leader, the right law, or the right suppression, we can make things go back to normal. That instinct often leads to repression, denial, and the use of force to preserve what no longer functions. But if a relationship, personal or societal, has reached the point where trust and legitimacy are gone, forcing continuity only deepens the damage. In those moments, the real question shifts from preservation to responsibility. And the question is no longer how do we save the system? That's not the question anymore. The question becomes, how do we preserve what matters as the system changes or breaks apart? That's where we are right now. How do we minimize harm? How do we protect people during the transition? And how do we avoid turning loss into cruelty? Accepting that some systems simply cannot be saved is not nihilism, it's maturity. It's just life. It allows societies to move from desperate control towards deliberate transition. Now, understanding this does not mean welcoming collapse. It means refusing to lie to ourselves about what is still possible. So just as in human relationships, clarity, even painful clarity, is often the first step towards a healthier future. That brings us back to leadership. Not leadership as rescue, not leadership as denial, but leadership as stewardship through loss. That's where we are. Chaos is leverage. It's not just breakdown. When institutions dissolve and when loyalties break, the immediate experience is chaos. And that word frightens us, and for good reason. Chaos can be violent. It can be disorienting and destabilizing. But chaos is not only destruction. Chaos is also plasticity. In periods of intense deinstitutionalization, the social order becomes malleable in ways that are impossible during stable times. And the old assumptions loosen up. New questions become askable, and previously unthinkable futures enter the realm of possibility. This is why moments of collapse are historically dangerous, but also historically decisive. And let's talk about why chaos alone is not enough. We can't just have chaos. Chaos by itself does not guarantee improvement. Left unguided, chaos often leads to scapegoating, authoritarian backlash, charismatic domination by individuals, or the recreation of the same exact structures under new names. We don't want that. What determines the outcome is not the presence of chaos, but the quality of information available during the chaos. And so when people are disoriented and afraid, they look for explanations. Why is this all happening? They look for meaning. They look for direction. And if those explanations are false, manipulated, or selectively hidden, the society does not reorient. It regresses. So knowledge is illumination. And this is where knowledge plays its decisive role. You see, knowledge that is uncensored, historically grounded, and not filtered through institutional self-protection. That kind of knowledge acts like turning the lights on in a dark room. It does not tell people what to choose. It does not command obedience, but it changes what can be seen. And when perception changes, choice changes. And this is the crucial distinction. Control forces the outcomes, but knowledge enables decisions. So we need to talk about the formation of new institutions. New societies do not emerge because someone designs them perfectly in advance. They emerge because people see more clearly. They understand their past more honestly. and they recognize which patterns must not be repeated. Out of that clarity, new institutions form. That's when it happens. New norms, what should happen? New norms stabilize, and new boundaries are drawn. So this process, honestly, folks, it's messy, it's uneven, and it cannot be centrally directed. But it is how lasting institutional renewal has always occurred. Let's talk now about the most important thing to my heart, the role of the Farsight Institute. This is where Farsight enters, not as a leader, not as an authority, and not as a replacement for human judgment. Farsight's role is epistemic, not political. We exist to provide uncensored access to information about human history, investigate questions that institutions avoid or suppress, and to explore the human spiritual condition using disciplined, replicable methods grounded in science. Remote viewing is not presented as a belief. It is presented as data. Data that challenges assumptions about time, consciousness, and the limits of human perception. That data does not dictate conclusions. It widens the field of vision. Why this matters during the transition period that we are now in? Well, in periods of collapse, which is where we are now, societies face a choice. Rebuild based on partial truths and inherited myths, or rebuild based on expanded understanding and honest reckoning. Now, the first path leads to repetition, but the second path creates the possibility of genuine change. Farsight does not tell humanity which path to choose. We work to ensure that the choice is made with your eyes open, not in the darkness. So leadership without command, revisited, is what we're all about. This brings us back to the idea of leadership, not as control, not as leadership, not as rescue, not as like a control system, but rather stewardship of knowledge. That's what real leadership is about. Leadership in these moments, it looks like protecting access to truth. It means resisting the temptation to suppress discomfort and trusting people to make hard decisions when given real information. This is not optimism. It's respect for human agency. So, let's close by talking about periods of deinstitutionalization. They're terrifying, I agree, because they expose us. But exposure is also what makes renewal possible. Chaos becomes leverage only when illumination is allowed to persist. That's why Farsight is so important to still exist for you. And that is the function that Farsight serves, not to decide humanity's future, but to help us ensure that humanity is finally able to decide for itself. So let's bring it all together, folks. Let me end by stepping back one last time. What we have been talking about is not one scandal, one institution, one historical moment. No. We have been talking about how societies face truth. And at certain moments in history, information emerges that simply cannot be put back into the box. And that's what's happening with the Epstein stuff. It changes how people see their leaders, big time, their institutions, and themselves. And when that happens, societies have only a few real options. They can try to force continuity through secrecy and suppression. They can try to restore order through control and fear. Or they can allow a period of disorientation to become a period of reorientation instead. So the core lesson, this is the central idea that I want you to take with you from this talk. Secrecy preserves order by hiding reality. Disclosure preserves freedom by revealing it. Secrecy can hold a system together for a period of time, but eventually it destroys the system's ability to adapt. Disclosure is painful. It destabilizes. It shocks. But it is also the only condition under which a society can renew itself without domination. So, what leadership really means here? Leadership in this moment like this, in moments like this, it's not about issuing commands. It's not about restoring old narratives or forcing people back into familiar roles. Leadership is about protecting access to the truth. That's what leadership is. It's resisting the urge to suppress discomfort. And it's trusting people to grow into responsibility when they are allowed to see clearly. So that kind of leadership does not control the outcomes. It creates the conditions under which better outcomes can emerge naturally. So we want to end with the role of knowledge. Knowledge does not tell us what to do. It tells us what is real. And when people are allowed to know what is real about history, about power, about themselves, they do not all make the same choices. But they make their own choices. And that is the foundation of any society that deserves to survive. One final thought. Friends, we may be living through a period where some institutions cannot be saved. That does not mean that society itself is lost. Sometimes the most responsible thing a system can do is to let go of what no longer works, rather than preserve it at all costs. So what comes next depends not on secrecy, not on force, not on saviors. It depends on whether we are willing to face reality together, friends, together, and whether we trust ourselves enough to decide what kind of society we want to become. And that is the real challenge of our time. And that is where I'll leave you tonight. Friends, I love you. We've had a great turnout. And, of course, I should ask you all to be sure to sign up to our free newsletter on our website, farsight.org. And definitely, you need to subscribe to farsightprime.com. farsightprime.com is essential. It's not a source of leisure viewing that competes with Disney, Paramount Plus, and things like that, Netflix. It's an essential thing that you need to have. It's the place where we're going to be showing you the truth of what's really been happening over a very long period of time, so you can navigate what's coming at us really fast. I love you all, and I'm glad we had a good turnout today, and I'm really glad people are here listening. And I'm going to see you again in 1 week, and be on the alert. Be sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and click that notifications bell, because we're going to be starting our live streams. We held off for the live streams for a little bit because it was so cold, but it's starting to warm up, so we can start them finally. The live streams have to happen outside. And then in March, it's going to be big time. I'm taking you to secret locations. That will be fun. All right, everybody. Love you all. Take care, and I'll see you again next Sunday in 1 week.